6 assassins. 1 target. 1 half-mile stretch of road. A bomb that bounced off an armored car. A river too shallow to drown in. A poison that didn't work. And a car that took a wrong turn and stopped directly in front of the only man who still had bullets. This is the story of how the most consequential assassination in modern history almost didn't happen, and how, when it finally did, it happened almost entirely by accident. June 28, 1914. Sarajevo, Bosnia. The sun was already warm by the time the motorcade began to move. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was not supposed to be popular in Sarajevo. Bosnia had only been formally annexed by Austria-Hungary 6 years earlier. The streets were full of people who resented foreign rule, who dreamed of a Slavic nation free from imperial control. His advisors had warned him. The security arrangements were inadequate. The route had been published in the morning newspapers, which meant anyone who wanted to find him knew exactly where he would be. Franz Ferdinand came anyway. What he didn't know, what no one in his motorcade knew, was that 6 young men had read those same newspapers. 6 young men had spent weeks planning what they intended to do with that information. They called themselves Young Bosnia. They believed in a free South Slavic state. They had been trained, equipped, and sent across the border from Serbia with weapons supplied by a shadowy Serbian nationalist group known as the Black Hand. 4 pistols, 6 grenades, 6 cyanide capsules, 1 for each man, to be swallowed after the mission was complete. They were not professional killers. They were students and idealists, the oldest among them barely 24 years old. They had never done anything like this before, and it showed. The plan was simple. The 6 men spread themselves out along the Appel Quay, the main road along the river where the motorcade would pass. If the first man failed, the second would act. If the second failed, the third. A chain of backup plans stretched across half a mile of Sarajevo's streets. The first car in the motorcade passed, then the second, then the Archduke's car. The first man in the chain was Mehmedbašić. He had a grenade in his pocket and a pistol at his side. As the Archduke's open-topped car rolled past him, Mehmedbašić did nothing. A police officer was standing too close. He froze. The car continued. The second man, Čubrilović, was 19 years old. He had a pistol and a grenade. As the car approached, he looked at the crowds lining the street. Men, women, children pressed together to watch the procession. He couldn't do it. He lowered his weapon. The car passed him too. 2 down. The third man was Čubrilović. He did not hesitate. As the Archduke's car drew level with him, he struck his grenade against a lamppost to arm it and threw it directly at Franz Ferdinand. What happened next became one of the strangest moments in the history of political assassination. The grenade struck the folded-back convertible roof of the car and bounced. It rolled off and fell into the road, landing beneath the following vehicle. It exploded. The car behind the Archduke was destroyed. Approximately 20 people in the crowd were injured. Franz Ferdinand felt the explosion. He looked back, and then his car accelerated and drove on. Čubrilović, believing he had succeeded, immediately bit down on his cyanide capsule and threw himself over the railing into the Miljacka River below. The cyanide failed to work. It was old, too diluted to kill. And the river, which looked significant from the bridge, was barely 10 centimeters deep at that point in the summer. He stood up in ankle-deep water, was dragged out by the crowd, and beaten before the police arrived to arrest him. The remaining 3 men in the chain watched the motorcade speed past them. The opportunity was gone. By the time the cars had cleared the Appel Quay, the men were scattered, the plan had collapsed, and the Archduke was alive. Gavrilo Princip, 19 years old, born in a small village in western Bosnia, the son of a postman, stood on the street corner and understood that it was over. He had been one of the last men in the chain. He had not fired. There had been nothing to fire at. He walked away from the Appel Quay. He had a loaded pistol in his pocket and nowhere to go. He stopped in front of Schiller's Delicatessen, a small shop on Franz Joseph Street, just around the corner from the Latin Bridge. He stood there on the pavement, thinking about what had happened, about what had not happened. He had given up. Meanwhile, Franz Ferdinand's motorcade arrived at Sarajevo City Hall. The reception proceeded as planned, with speeches and formal greetings. But the Archduke was visibly shaken and visibly furious. He interrupted the city official reading a welcoming address. He had, he said, come to Sarajevo on a state visit and had been greeted with bombs. He was not pleased. After the ceremony, a decision was made. Franz Ferdinand would change his plans. He wanted to visit the people who had been injured in the explosion. His people hurt because of him. The route was changed. The motorcade would travel to the Sarajevo hospital. One critical piece of communication was forgotten. Someone forgot to tell the lead driver. The motorcade left City Hall and turned onto Franz Joseph Street, following the original route, the wrong route. A senior official in one of the lead cars realized the mistake almost immediately and called out to the driver. The driver, confused, slowed down and began to reverse the car to turn around. The engine stalled. The car sat motionless on the cobblestones of Franz Joseph Street, directly in front of Schiller's delicatessen. Gavrilo Princip looked up from the pavement. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was sitting in an open-topped car less than 2 meters away from him, stationary, exposed, with no barrier between them. Princip did not think. He stepped forward, drew his pistol, and fired twice. The first bullet struck Sophie, the Archduke's wife, in the abdomen. The second struck Franz Ferdinand in the jugular vein. The car lurched forward, the driver panicking. Franz Ferdinand began to bleed heavily. His aide pressed cloth against the wound. Sophie collapsed across her husband's lap. As they drove toward the governor's residence, those in the car tried to understand what had happened. Franz Ferdinand's last known words were spoken to his wife. "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." Sophie died before the car arrived. Franz Ferdinand died approximately an hour later. Princip had also tried to kill himself. He swallowed his cyanide capsule. It failed, as Čubrilović had. He tried to turn the pistol on himself and was seized by the crowd before he could fire. He was beaten, nearly lynched, and handed over to the police. He was 19 years old. Under Austro-Hungarian law, he was too young to be executed. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He developed tuberculosis in his cell, lost an arm to the disease, and died in April 1918, 4 years into his sentence. 4 years into the war, his 2 bullets had helped to start. He was 23 years old. There is no clear evidence he ever fully understood what he had set in motion. Within 6 weeks of the assassination, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized in Serbia's defense. Germany declared war on Russia. France entered. Britain entered. The Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria joined on the other side. The war that followed killed approximately 20 million people. 4 empires. Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and German collapsed entirely. The borders of Europe were redrawn. The conditions created by that war gave rise to the circumstances that produced the Second World War, which killed 50 million more. All of it flowing from a wrong turn. A stalled engine. A 19-year-old standing on a pavement outside a delicatessen, having already given up. Historians have debated for over a century whether the First World War was inevitable, whether the tensions between the great powers were so extreme that some triggering event was bound to come. Perhaps. But the specific shape of history, the specific morning, the specific men, that was not inevitable. That was accident layered upon accident. The conspirators had been discovered in other cities. The plan had nearly been abandoned before it started. 5 of 6 men failed at their assigned moment. The one who succeeded did not succeed because he was in position, following the plan. He succeeded because his target's driver did not know the route had changed. What this tells us is something deeply uncomfortable about the way we understand cause and effect. We look backward at history and see pattern and inevitability, great forces producing great events. But history, as it is lived, is filled with people standing on street corners having given up and cars that take wrong turns. Gavrilo Princip was not a master strategist. He was a teenager from a poor Bosnian village who believed in an idea large enough to die for. Whether he was a terrorist or a freedom fighter is still debated. In Serbia, he was long regarded as a hero of national liberation. In Austria and Bosnia, the memory is more complicated. History rarely produces clean answers about men who do terrible things in the name of causes they believe are just. What is not debated is the sequence of events. 6 men, repeated failure, a driver's mistake, 2 shots at 2 meters, and 20 million dead. The next time someone tells you that history moves in great inevitable tides, remember the sandwich, remember the shallow river, remember the driver who didn't know the route had changed. History is not inevitable. It is the accumulation of moments. And sometimes, the most important moment is the one where someone who has already given up is standing in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time.